you're only going to have to worry about that if you want to become the 51st state and have
Yeah.
cut.
I was going with us becoming the 11th province, which I've seen a couple of people
Yeah.
suggest. Hello, this is the Fiction Nonfiction podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your social media feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Vivi Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, author of the novel Brotherless Night.
And I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant. Did you watch the Four Nations hockey face-off?
I mean, am I Minnesotan? What kind of question is this?
Okay, fair enough. Also, I don't know if you noticed this, but it was advertised all the time on X. I don't know if Musk did some deal there or whatever. Anyway, that's a side deal. I have a couple questions for you about this. First of all, who were the Four Nations?
You mean other than the US and Canada?
That's
Finland
right, I bet.
Finland and Sweden.
Okay, you're in the 10% of Americans who could answer that question, I would say.
So Finland and Sweden, but no one's paying attention to Finland and Sweden. Sorry, Finland and Sweden. Okay, wait, actually, as a Minnesotan, I can't say that and live. Everyone in Minnesota actually, people here actually definitely care.
There's some ancestry issues up there, I would think.
Yeah, I tremble in fear of the American Swedish Institute. But even so, this was really kind of a Trump versus Trudeau grudge match.
Well, Finland and Sweden would probably be happy to be left out of that, along with Denmark, who'd probably our president to stop trying to abscond with Greenland. But look, this sporting event, which I am a fan of sporting events, but I'm not a fan of sporting events being hijacked by politics in this way. Canadians are booing the U.S. national anthem and changing the words to theirs, largely thanks to our president, who spent the past month threatening to impose tariffs on Canadian goods and claiming that they would be better off as the 51st state of the United States. This is the first time I've ever heard anyone say that. It's such a bizarre thing to say. Anyway, that's what's been happening.
And he predicted a U.S. win and reportedly called the team before the game, which, as you know, as a Chiefs fan, is the kiss of death.
It's please don't call the team. They're going to lose if you do that.
I mean, he did also predict a win for the Chiefs in the Super Bowl, and we all know how that went. Let's linger in that for a second.
The last time we'll be talking about that on this show.
And a couple of nights ago, we're recording on Saturday, February 22nd, the Canadians defeated the U.S. hockey team in overtime.
And the Canadian Prime Minister, Trudeau, immediately wrote on X, which is like having to go to your opponent's house to I don't know, write messages. You can't take our country and you can't take our game. So what's going on here? I don't recall. This is more my Ruzioni, the goalkeeper from America's dream team when we defeated the Russians, was at this game, and it made the Canada versus Trump thing felt like the Americans versus the Russians in this thing. I don't like being on the Russian side of stuff. What's going on in Trump's head? What's he doing?
The writing prompt no one wants describe Trump's interior life. It's a completely oblique space to me, and we're not going to be able to ask him what's going on in his head, nor do I necessarily want to, but we can talk to two amazing Canadian authors about the relationship their work has to Canadian history and identity and how their country is reacting to Trump's threats.
Kai Thomas is an author and educator. His background and body of work span from land stewardship, carpentry, and small-scale farming to historical research and scholarship. His debut novel, In the Upper Country, was awarded the 2023 Atwood Gibson Writers' Trust Prize for Fiction and was shortlisted for the Governor General's Award for Fiction and the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction, the Amazon Canada First Novel Award, and the Hurston Wright Legacy Award for debut fiction, as well as the Rakuten Kobo Emerging Writer Prize. The work has been featured in news outlets such as NPR, CBC, The New York Times, and the Globe and Mail. Kai, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Suzette Mayr is the author of 6 novels, including the most recent, The Sleeping Car Porter, which was the winner of the 2022 Giller Prize, the Georges Bonnier Award for Fiction, and the City of Calgary's W.O. Mitchell Book Prize. The novel was also shortlisted for the 2024 Dublin Literary Award, the finalist for the 2023 Governor General's Award for Fiction, and was shortlisted for the inaugural Carol Shields Prize for Fiction and the Republic of Consciousness Prize. She teaches creative writing at the University of Calgary. Suzette, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so let's do a little level setting here. I mean, Canadians are always in some basic way pissed off at the Americans, like as like just sort of it's like resting. I was going to say resting bitch face, but that seems negative. We have that for you. Like I feel like we're loud, obnoxious. We think we're cool. We mostly ignore Canada or make fun of it. So I understand there's a level of that at a certain point. That's like normal status for relations. But how much has President Trump, changed Canadians' feelings toward your southern neighbors? Is it a question of degree, or is there something like new happening here? Kai, let's start with you.
Yeah, my sense with that is it is a question of degree in my kind of observation. Although, if anything is new, it's that heightened um, reactionary uh, state of affairs, I guess. If anything is new, it's this newfound sense of either anxiety, trepidation, excitement among some factions of Canadians for sure. And just kind of like, yeah, an upping of the stakes of what I feel has probably for centuries been a somewhat um, tense relationship, and if not tense, one in which, at least on the Canadian side of things, we're constantly defining ourselves against the US in many ways when it comes to our national identity.
Yeah, and
Sus-
I would just say, sorry,
oh no, I was just going to say, Suzette, how about you?
I'd say that where I am, the booing of the American anthem at different sports events kind of says it all at this point. I think Canadians have banded together, at least among the people I hang out with. They've banded together in a way that hasn't happened in a long time because there are some pretty major regional differences in Canada, and those differences are being smoothed over as we face that larger national threat of the tariffs from the US.
So
So,
do you have the same thing where like the middle of the country is conservative and the coasts are more liberal? Is that what you're talking about?
kind of, kind of. There's also the issue of Quebec as well, which is
Oh, right.
yeah, so Quebec's a whole other entity unto itself. And I'm in the West, and it is more conservative here. Vancouver, or BC rather, the West tends to be more liberal or left, I guess. And then Kai, I would say no, like the Maritimes, they kind of go all over the place, right? But they're mostly more liberal.
Yeah, I think in broad strokes, it's a fair assessment to, you know, demarcate the center of Canada and then the coast. But really, there's interesting pockets everywhere. The
Yeah.
Quebec factor is real, and then when you go north, it's a whole other can of fish with Northwest Territories, Nunavut, etc. So yeah, there's a lot going on, and there's a big expanse of land.
Yeah. But we're all coming together because
True. The
the tariffs are freaking us out.
the
And
Team
Trump is,
Canada approach, right?
oh yeah, absolutely Team Canada. Yeah.
So now that you all are newly unified against your terrible enemy, um, and I've been seeing stuff like, I don't know, grocery store shelves labeled with, here are the American things, know what you're buying. How are Canadians talking about this to each other? What are the newspapers saying, the CBC? Is it the kind of thing where you go to the store and this is the small talk? What are you all hearing when you talk within your communities?
I think within my community, it's mostly us sitting in our corners in puddles of our own puke, rocking back and forth from fear, because we're seriously scared. There's an expression that when Canada, or what is it? When the US sneezes, Canada gets a cold. And so whatever happens in the US, it's going to happen triply worse over here.
Hmm.
So we've been banding together, doing what we can just to buy Canadian. There are little Canadian, maple leafs on different products. We've been sharing viral videos there's a satirical news show called This Hour's 22 Minutes, and it's gone viral because it's all about buying Canadian and how to buy Canadian and what is Canadian and what's not Canadian. So it's, seriously, I think a lot of people are really, really scared. And I've been trying to just keep away from anything but, proper news outlets because it's just so terrifying. And the news is coming 24/7 about Doge. Is that how you say it? I've only ever read it. So Doge.
Yeah, well, we're doing that. You're only going to have to worry about that if you want to become the 51st state and have some
Yeah.
pay cut.
I was going with us becoming the 11th province, which I've seen a couple of people suggest.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Well, does anyone? I mean, so that's the thing. It's funny. I don't. I didn't. I guess realize the level of fear because it seems to me like, to me, what Trump's tariff threats seem transparently bullshit. Like he's not going to do it, and he ended up retracting them after fairly minor concessions from Trudeau. I mean, Trudeau's like, "Hey, we'll have a fentanyl czar. There's no fentanyl crossing the border. It's not a problem." So, but it is legitimately something. I mean, it is legitimately frightening. Are people sure that there would be a terrible economic impact if there were tariffs? Do people really think that he's going to do something as stupid as that?
I think people don't know what he's gonna do, and
Okay,
that's
fair enough.
partly in I think that's part of where the fear comes from. I think it's also, you know, there's a fear and there's a sense of disruption at the very least in that he is I think the ways uh that he speaks and the impacts of that speech even before he became president. On my end, I don't live in Canada currently. I live in upstate New York, but in conversation with family members, for example, I have a cousin who works for the RCMP, Canada's National Police Force, and she studies data. And she was telling me about how, before he became president, when he tweeted that thing, when he tweeted about tariffs, there was an immediate response in terms of Canadian allocation to border security. Before he even stepped into office, right? And so I think there's fear too in the sense of um, it's a reminder of the power, I guess, that he has, and I guess this general sense of Canada being in this position of uh, being under the influence of this imperial power directly to the south, and that having repercussions that, you know, whether the tariffs go ahead or not, being at the whim of an empire in collapse.
I think part of the problem too is that because I live in a part of the country that slants more conservative, although quite a few people are not conservative. There's the problem of precedent that Trump is presenting, so our premier in Alberta seems to be of the mind that what sometimes she comes across as very not Team Canada and as if what Trump is suggesting and what Doge is suggesting is a good idea. They've been coming for the DEI programs. They've put in all kinds of restrictions for trans rights in our province. And so the fact that, I think that there's a terrible example being set that unfortunately is going to feed like the populist influences in Canada, and there's Pierre Poilievre is the leader of the Conservative Party, and he quite possibly might be the next Prime Minister of Canada. And he's very, very, I mean, he's slanting so Republican. It's really scary. And I think it's terrible to see what Trump is able to get away with, because I think that people here who maybe don't have our best interests might think that those are good ideas and want to replicate them here.
So had the Trump
Go ahead, Whitney.
Actually, I want to ask this question. So have the Trump attacks emboldened the conservative elements of Canadian society, or have they driven them back, into the Team Canada thing? Like you were saying, like you think, Suzette, that it'll give conservatives an opportunity to enact similar anti-DEI measures or anti-trans measures that Trump has been successful in implementing. Um, and I just wondered if you could just talk a little bit about what conservative Canada is looking like now. Maybe we'll start with Kai.
Sure. Well, I know conservative Canada, there's different factions of conservative Canada. You have Doug Ford in Ontario, for example, who is calling a snap election with the hopes of gaining an even greater majority than he already has, and really justifying that move in by claiming that he needs more power in order to combat Trump. Um, at the same time, there are more far-right leaning factions of Canadian society. I believe like founding members of the Proud Boys were even Canadian, and so you have similar MAGA-esque groups that have very strong and historic presence here as well. So there's all different shades.
Yeah. It's been interesting to see Poilievre because he was very much, in a position prior to all of the tariff talk. He was very much about attacking Trudeau, and trying to divide Canada. And ever since the tariff threat came in, suddenly he's Mr. No, Canada first, Canada for everyone. I think it's probably just lip service, honestly. So I don't think that he's not into trans rights. He's not into, being pro DEI. So I think there's a lot of lip service being paid right now, but yeah, it's hard to say.
It's interesting because I mean, Trump could sort of, right, he can inspire opposition and also he can embolden people to follow the same lines. And just sort of when I think about like European politics, for example, like if we were talking about France, right, the left would be so far to the left of the American left that the word left would in the conversation like need to be redefined, and Democrats would functionally be Republicans. And like is it like when we're saying conservative
This
here,
somewhat
like
idealized view of France there.
I know, but I mean, I guess I'm thinking of like my French relatives who are aligned with the Green Party and are totally disgusted with.
Okay.
Anyway, but like when we say Canadian conservatism, like is that like does that mean the same thing as we do? Like is it like is Canada as a whole slightly to the left of us, or is it like pretty much in the same like are we actually defining the terms in the same way, do you think?
I think we're more center left. I think Canada is more center left, but it's more central. I don't know, Kai, what would you say?
Yeah, maybe slightly more left, but I don't think consequentially, to be honest. And I think, I bring up Doug Ford, and I don't think, I think there's a nuance here in that, if conservatives in Canada are pushing a nationalist agenda, that's not to say that in much of the ways that matter, they are
Yeah.
not aligned with Republican in Republican agenda in America, right? In the United States. So there's nuances there, and I think it can be hard to see through those when you have an opposition to the threat of annexation. But in my view, for most, I don't know, political uh, political agendas that are of consequence, we're not that different, to be honest, when it comes down to it. Um, and
Although
we
we
can
have
get
free
into the
healthcare.
weeds.
We have
But it's
free
a that's a
healthcare.
big one. That's a big one.
Huge, huge.
It's a big one.
Sugi, I think we should transition into the questions about the novel there.
Yes, sounds good.
Okay.
3, 2, 1. So, Kai, your novel In the Upper Country begins in 1859 in the small Canadian hamlet of Dunmore. And there's a real Dunmore in southern Alberta, at least that's what the internet tells me. But my sense is that's not where your Dunmore is. And I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about that place and why you chose to set your novel there.
Sure. Yeah. So I created this fictional town of Dunmore, and it's set in what's now southern Ontario. So yeah, just north of northern New York, and actually Michigan would be just east of Michigan, I guess. So across the Lake Erie. Um, and I said it there because when I was doing research about the Underground Railroad, and in particular this chapter of the Underground Railroad, in which Canada became the preferred destination for people fleeing enslavement, I learned about all of these small towns and communities that were part of bigger cities or towns that emerged that were populated by this wave and this surge of black folks fleeing the American South. And so that's where the idea came from. And I tried to identify a geographic region that didn't have an existing town and create kind of a composite town that mixed different elements of some of the real towns and communities that existed, and was different in slight ways to kind of provide a setting to explore the questions that I was curious about with regards to this chapter of history.
There's a town I'm in Kansas City, and there's a town west of here in Kansas called Nicodemus, Kansas, which is an all-black town that was settled by freed slaves, right? At a time when Kansas was a free state, as it famously was during the Civil War era. I imagine this town being somewhat like that, like these are these towns that have been settled by these escaping slaves across the border. Um, Novels in the U.S. about the Underground Railroad, from like Huck Finn to Colson Whitehead's The Underground Railroad, generally imagine enslaved people escaping from South and North within the United States, right? And I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit more about how the Underground Railroad worked in Canada, and read a passage from the book about that.
Certainly. So the Underground Railroad in Canada, there's this chapter of history following 1850. In 1850, there was a bill passed called the Fugitive Slave Act, and this essentially deputized people in free states to catch and confine people who were fleeing enslavement. So between this period between 1850 and emancipation, 65, that is when Canada kind of became the destination, because fleeing to a place like perhaps Kansas or New York, for example, where previously would have been um, uh, a good destination to go to, was no longer as safe. And so this is the period of time where these Canadian destinations became more populated. So that's the historical context there. And yes, I will gladly read a section from the book here to bring us there a little bit. Some towns were robust enough to allow for the development of boarding houses, often for the express purpose of providing rooms for runaways. But these towns were regular towns, not backwoods Negro villages. In Dunmore, there were a few citizens with the means to host fugitives for as long as was needed. The length of the stay simply depended on the case. Many fugitives were just passing through, usually on their way somewhere else, Buxton, Chatham, Hamilton, or Toronto if they had crossed to Detroit, New Canaan, Amherstburg, or Windsor if they were heading west from Niagara. An all-Negro town seemed a sensible place to rest for a few days, sensible enough to come south off the main highway into swamp country and see what the legends were about. Some folks stayed long enough to work up the will to travel back south to rescue or petition for the freedom of a loved one they'd left behind. They might ride back down the Underground Railroad with the help of the True Band's network in Michigan, New York, Indiana, Ohio, and beyond. It was rare that we would see them again. Other fugitives would have a relation or a friend who was already established in Dunmore. In that case, they would stay with them until they either wanted or needed their own home. And often enough, even if they had no previous relation, fugitives would decide to stay on in Dunmore. The True Band would get the money together to purchase a lot and gather the men to raise a house with a hearth, and women to stock it with quilts and food for a season. With all the volunteer labor and the low cost of swampland, the debt for a house was quite modest and could be easily paid off in a few years by any working man or woman. In the interim between arrival and whatever came next, fugitives would be put up with someone who had the extra room and provisions. Simeon had built the cabin atop the root cellar in the shade and privacy of the oak savanna for the purpose of hosting Dunmore's new arrivals. The cabin was a simple, well-built place, with a pot-belly stove in the center that had been donated by a visiting abolitionist. There was a wash basin and several beds, and from inside one could hear the song of birds and the wind through the swaying oak all around.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Um,
pleasure.
Americans on the left, of which I'm one, often I think view Canada as like this kind of utopia above the border who has healthcare and is better on race issues and deals with their indigenous population better than we do. And that portrait of that town is kind of amazing there. But also in the beginning of the book, and as one progresses through the book, um, uh, the character says, even then, I had seen enough to know that behind every glorious thing is a whole mess of trouble. So, I want you to, yes, okay, um, this seems like a wonderful, perfect world, right? But could you talk a little bit about the complications and critiques that you have of Canadian society from the perspective of your characters who are,
Sure.
yeah,
Yeah, no, gladly. I think, part of the impetus to write the book was to complicate the narrative, I guess the one that you're speaking to and the one that we grow up with in Canada, which is that um, our national identity is really birthed from this um period in which this nation was the promised land for people fleeing enslavement, and a period slightly previous to that wherein um British and French really banded together on equal terms with indigenous nations and kind of defined a national identity that way. This is the War of 1812. Again, uh, apropos, repelling the invading Americans. So our Canadian national mythology, as I've come to think about it, is a mythology not in the sense that um, all of the elements there didn't really happen. In most cases, they did, but in the sense that these stories have been cherry-picked from a wide array of historical experiences, many of which were not in the same vein as this notion of being a promised land, as this notion of being a pluralistic society. And so one of the things that a lot of people don't know is, for over 2 centuries before this period of 1850, specifically before 1834, Canada, under the British colonial regime and the French colonial regime, was a slaveholding state or slaveholding states. Not to the same scale, and largely because there's no plantation economy here because of the climate, but in the same sense, in terms of having institutions that supported enslavement, that has supported all of the brutalities that we know of, and and the rest, and were enslavers not only of Africans, but in certain places predominantly of indigenous people as well. So those were elements that I wanted to bring to light with this story. And over and above that, um, it speaks to the fact that this Underground Railroad did not just end in Canada for those periods during which people were enslaved. It went both ways. People would escape um, enslaved labor on the Canadian side and escape, whether across the river to Detroit or to Vermont or to New York. It happened that way as well. And so I wanted to complicate that narrative and bring that to light. And beyond that, I wanted to bring to light the fact that, even during this period where people found relative safety here, Black folks found relative safety here, there were still many instances of racial violence, sundown towns, de facto segregation, unequal opportunities, the whole gamut. And so it looked different, but not in the ways that our mythologies have led us to believe. And I think I thought, and I still feel that it's important to be able to hold the messiness and the complexity of our history through stories. So that's where I was coming from.
So
Hey,
interesting to
Sugi, I know
hear.
you have a
Go ahead.
question there. I just want, for time wise, I think we're going to have to switch to Suzette here.
Okay.
You want to take the question that I have written there for me?
Sure.
Okay.
Then, so the next two are for you. So you will take, okay. So you would end up taking the next one. All
I
right.
just messed that up.
It's fine. 3, 2, 1. Kai, it's so interesting to hear you talk about that. Just as a kid who grew up reading a lot of Canadian literature, I actually feel like a lot of the early white supremacy I learned from literature was actually Canadian literature. And I had to really think about, finding Black writers, Indigenous writers, to kind of counter that. And so, Suzette,
Sugi,
your
just
novels
casually saying that you learned about white supremacy from Canadian literature is a little bit of a bomb throw there. Who are you thinking of?
I'm thinking actually specifically of like, I was one of those kids who was like reading all of Ella Montgomery, and right, like, I mean, Anne of Green Gables is held up as this like paragon of like look, this tiny feminist heroine, and then there's like a lot of casual anti-indigenous like racism that is
Okay.
built in there. There's sort of like subtle references to South Asians in there. It is and it's like a real part of my brain, those books, in like a really in a troubling way. And so to kind of like I guess what I'm saying is that I think I bought into the mythology that you're
Okay.
describing as the child of people from the former British Commonwealth who read like a lot of like Australian, Canadian, British literature in a way that maybe other American kids were not necessarily doing, and thinking like in some way that that was like better and broader than US literature, which in some ways, of course, as you're saying, that messiness, it is. And also it's not unblemished or pure in some way. It's not necessarily more progressive. Sometimes the language of racism is just different. Like I remember hearing my Canadian cousins beef about the lip service of multiculturalism, which you all were both speaking about before. So, Suzette, your novel's main character is a Black porter who works on the train line between Toronto and Winnipeg. And I wonder if you could give us a sense of the geography of that ride. Tell us, like, have you taken that train?
Yeah. So it's between Toronto and Vancouver, actually. So I haven't taken the train ride because it's too expensive.
What does it
But
cost?
I don't even want to know.
Okay.
But all we could afford, my partner and I, was the trip from Winnipeg to Vancouver, which was 2 nights, and it was astronomical amounts of money. But we have driven it. I have driven across Canada, or taken the bus across Canada numerous times. And it's remarkable because you just get a sense of how big the country actually is in a way that you miss when you're flying. So Ontario just takes days, days and days and days of rocks and bushes. It's really, really, aside from the cities. And then once you start hitting Manitoba, that sort of calms down. And then you start hitting the prairies, and then it's flat as can be. It's beautiful. I love it. Saskatchewan, Alberta, which is where I live. And then you hit the Rocky Mountains, and then suddenly it's all mountainous. And then I always loved when I was a kid, we used to, for Easter break, we would take the train from Alberta to Vancouver, and we'd go from dry, brown prairie to this increasingly lush rainforest kind of landscape. So it's just it's a beautiful, beautiful trip. And the Maritimes, that's a whole other beautiful part that my character Baxter doesn't experience in the book because he's not in that part of the country. Yeah.
I used to work on fishing boats in Ketchikan, Alaska. So we would fix our boat up in Seattle and then take it up. And I always remember going past Vancouver Island, and that whole entire area up there is incredible.
Yeah.
And the size of that, the train trip in general, the size of the country. I mean, I think that's a big part of your novel. And at least for me, Baxter has to stay awake for dangerous amounts of times. And he's got there's this incredibly complex demerit system that and he can only get a certain number of demerits or he's going to get fired, And I wondered if you could talk about that part of his work and his role in Canadian society at that time as a Black man, and then maybe read to us from the book.
Yeah, for sure. So I think that, the porter in my book is not much different from the Pullman porters in the United States, where, certainly pre-union, the job was extremely precarious. It was well paid, relatively speaking, for Black people, but it did require being on call 24/7. You could get fired at any moment for any reason and lose all your seniority. It was, and the demerit system was particularly egregious because, I was going through different archives and there were porters who were losing demerits for stepping on upholstery, for having a bad attitude, for not being polite, that kind of thing. And so if they collected too many demerits, they'd get fired. And so the passage I'm going to read from, so my book, it's about a train trip that a sleeping car porter is taking. That's 88 hours and 45 minutes from central Canada to the west coast. And in my book, the train gets caught in the Rocky Mountains for an additional 45 hours because of a mudslide. And the porters are sleep deprived enough But then when they hit the mountains and this happens, they're even more sleep deprived. So this is a scene. This is hour 96, where the sleeping car porters are just exhausted. And this scene takes place among the sleeping car porters at breakfast. Hour 96. At breakfast, crowded behind their curtain, neither Baxter nor the other porters talk while they eat. Not Ferdinand, not Freckles, not AP, not even Porter Templeton. Their somnolence sits crammed with them at the small table, forcing them to the very edges. The aching silence of the train, the stillness as they drag themselves down the halls of this opulent string of bedrooms on wheels. Cold cereal migrates too slowly from Baxter's spoon and down his throat into his gullet. He has only shreds of brown shoe shine left, and now he's running low on black too. Will he still have to pay for this food, even though the train being late is not his fault? The money he costed out for meals has been dribbling and evaporating. 5 towels have vaporized, gone, and that's going to cost him. He didn't budget for an extra day and a half, 2 days. He's lost count of the days-long hell in the mountains. He didn't budget for accumulating demerits and diminishing tips as the passengers grow more angry. In the creeping morning light, in the bushes, because Mad Mary finally took mercy on the porters and allowed them all off the oppressively stuffy train for a reprieve, he tries to jolt himself awake by leaping into calisthenic exercises. He huffs and puffs into star-shaped leaps, push-ups, squats, lunging with first one leg then the other, but he wobbles as he moves, his legs shifting with the automatic phantom movements of a traveling train. He closes his eyes for only a second, and a tiny dream pops up of him lying on an impossibly soft mattress, perfect for the princess and her pea, and her pea's pea. Templeton wanders by, fanning himself with a timetable in the heat. Through a green fork of bush, Mad Mary and Ferdinand confer about something farther up the train, and Baxter ducks further into the bushes, a branch digging into his elbow. He hopes he hasn't soiled his white jacket. He brought 3 shirts on this run. He'll get demerits for grime collecting on the shirts after days and days, even if he manages to keep the stains off them. Damn. His shoulders sag. He splashes his face with cold, fresh water from the mountain creek. He drinks melting glacier, plunges his hands into the water past the point of ice just to wake himself up and calm himself down. He ascends into the vestibule, his legs shaky, his hands icy numb. The train is 2 nights late, less 2 hours. He wonders if the porter whose shift he's covering has recovered from the pneumonia, and how that porter will manage the loss of money, the growing stain of unreliability that attaches itself to every instance he falls sick. Or perhaps the porter has lain in bed this whole time, still sleeping after 96 hours.
Thank you so much. Gosh, I feel such sympathy for Baxter. And his predicament reminds me of stories that we're reading now about US federal workers, some of them Trump voters, who are being fired by Elon Musk's Department of Governmental Efficiency, or DOGE, which we were discussing before we started taping, for not meeting performance standards, even though they've received perfect performance evaluations. Like, Baxter's really good at his job. And yet it's set up kind of for him to fail. Is there a difference between Canadian and American ideas about fair treatment at work, or are those myths actually alike?
I think they're alike. I really do. And especially when I think about the history of the Brotherhood. When I think of the history of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, you know, the union organizing that happened in the US and the union organizing that happened in Canada, a lot of it is the same, and it's for the same reasons, which is because of this terrible precarity of the work, because of the terrible conditions of the work. I mean, my heart is going out to all these people who are just losing their jobs after doing a perfectly good job, and they're losing their jobs for completely random reasons. It's a lot like the porters, a lot like the porters. And when I was doing research in the Pullman archives in Chicago, you know, I over and over again found records of porters who were being dismissed for the most stupid reasons, and it was absolutely ridiculous.
Suki mentioned was talking about white supremacy in Canada. I mean, like, using arbitrary punishment systems or ways that systems like that maintain power, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think what's interesting in the case of Doge right now is, like, Elon Musk applying the old random punishment system that white supremacy has used against people of color for many years on white people, and they weren't ready for it. They didn't think it was going to happen, and like suddenly like, oh, this isn't fair, right? I mean, am I wrong to make those connections?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think that's exactly right. Elon Musk and Doge, that's a new animal. I don't know what it's going to look like a year from now, but it sure sounds the same. Absolutely.
So what this is we'll just sum up. We'll end up here by asking you an impossible question, which always is fun to do at the end. I wonder how do you both envision US-Canada relationships a year from now, or 4 years from now after Trump? Will this close relationship, which has been actually a close relationship for quite some time, repair itself somehow, or is this a rupture that's going to actually create some permanent change in the ways that Canadians think about America? Maybe we can start with Kai.
My guess is that the disruption of even just the threat of tariffs, as we started talking about, will be enough to create some lasting change in terms of the ways that Canadians choose to approach our economic relations. It does a lot when someone like Trump tries to circumvent trade agreements that have been in place for a while, and it erodes at a sense of trust and stability that my guess is that will create. And the question being, what will be the growing pains or the pains just generally associated with that. I don't know. It remains to be seen exactly what it'll look like. But at least from what I'm hearing and reading now, it does seem like a shift is imminent.
Yeah, it's really hard to say. I completely agree with what you're saying, Kai. And what I'm wondering is how it's going to affect our politics, really. I think it could affect, all kinds of, maybe even the federal election. Yeah. Who knows? Who knows?
I think the sad thing is, regardless of how things shift, it seems like the only guarantee is more neoliberal capitalism, because it's like in a moment like this, that's people, it's not a moment where people are going to feel inspired to shift the status quo in meaningful ways. And on whatever side of the border you're on, that seems to be the direction in which people are going to respond, or institutions will respond to this type of politics.
Hi, and Suzette. Thank you so much for joining us. We will take that prediction and worry about it for the next couple of years.
More neoliberal capitalism for you guys. Trust us.
Yeah.
Listeners, you can find In the Upper Country and The Sleeping Car Porter, as well as Kai and Suzette's other work, in your local independent bookstores. Don't miss them. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. I'm going to go drink my cup of maple syrup right now.